Case 1. Offender, Sarah Jo Pender. Date, October the 24th, 2000. County, Marion County, Indiana. In the heart of Indianapolis, in a quiet rental home that neighbors thought was unremarkable, two young lives were about to be lost in a single night. And the young woman at the center of it would go on to become one of the most talked about women in Indiana's criminal history. Sarah Jo Pender was 21 years old in the fall of 2000. She shared a house with two roommates, Andrew Cataldi and Tricia Nordman, along with her boyfriend, Richard Hull. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary living arrangement between young adults navigating early adulthood together. Behind closed doors, prosecutors would later argue, something far darker was taking shape. On the night of October the 24th, investigators say Pender had purchased a 12-gauge shotgun. That weapon would be used later that same evening by Hull to take the lives of both roommates inside the home they all shared. What happened next is what would separate this case from so many others that came before it in Marion County, because the two who did not survive that night were not the only ones held responsible for what followed. According to court records, Pender did not call for help. She did not walk away. Instead, prosecutors say she helped wrap the two victims in blankets and helped move their remains to a trash bin in the 800 block of Michael Street, in a residential stretch of Indianapolis where families were going about their evening just blocks away, completely unaware of what had happened. It wasn't long before investigators pieced together the timeline, and both Pender and Hull were taken into custody. What made this case explode into national headlines wasn't just the tragedy of two lives lost. It was the role prosecutors say Pender played in orchestrating it. During trial, prosecutors described her as the driving psychological force behind the entire plot, going so far as to call her the female Charles Manson for what they argued was her ability to manipulate Hull into carrying out the act itself. Whether or not that comparison feels fair, it stuck, and it followed her for the rest of her life. Pender was convicted and sentenced to 110 years in prison. For most offenders, that would be the end of the story. For Sarah Jo Pender, it was only the beginning of the next chapter. In August of 2008, while incarcerated at the Rockville Correctional Facility, Pender did something almost no one saw coming. She escaped. For months, she evaded capture, becoming the subject of a nationwide manhunt. Her case was featured on America's Most Wanted, turning her from a regional cautionary tale into a household name across the country. Tips poured in from viewers, convinced they'd spotted her. Law enforcement chased leads across state lines. And finally, in December of that same year, she was located and taken back into custody in Chicago, Illinois. Her escape added an entirely new layer to a case that was already difficult for the Indianapolis community to process. It raised hard questions about prison security, about how someone convicted of such a serious crime could simply walk away from custody, and about what accountability really means when the story doesn't end at sentencing. Today, Sarah Jo Pender remains behind bars, and the case continues to be studied by true crime researchers and criminal justice students alike, not just for the crime itself, but for what it revealed about manipulation, complicity, and the different ways the justice system defines responsibility when more than one person is involved in a single act of violence. If anything in this case has affected you, or if you or someone you know is dealing with an abusive or manipulative relationship, please know that support is available through the National Domestic Violence Hotline, free and confidential, any hour of the day. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 2. Offender Judy Kirby. Date, March the 25th, 2000. County, Morgan County, Indiana. Some cases in Indiana's history don't involve a struggle behind closed doors or a carefully laid plan. Some happen in broad daylight on a public highway, in front of witnesses who will never forget what they saw. This is one of those cases. Judy Kirby was 30 years old, driving a Pontiac Firebird down State Road 67 in Martinsville, Indiana, on the afternoon of March the 25th, 2000. What happened next would leave an entire community in shock, and would raise a question that still echoes through this case today. How does something like this happen, and why? Witnesses told investigators that Kirby began driving directly into oncoming traffic at high speed on the wrong side of the road. Multiple drivers were forced off the roadway, just trying to avoid a head-on collision, swerving into ditches and shoulders in a desperate effort to survive what was unfolding in front of them. For those drivers, the terror of that afternoon would stay with them long after the sirens arrived. The collision that followed was catastrophic. Kirby's vehicle struck an oncoming minivan directly. When first responders arrived at the scene, the scale of what had happened became clear almost immediately. 7 people lost their lives that day. 3 of Kirby's own young children, her nephew, and 3 occupants riding in the minivan she struck. It remains one of the deadliest single-vehicle incidents in the state's history, involving a deliberate act rather than an accident. Judy Kirby survived the crash. In the investigation that followed, authorities determined that this was not a case of a driver losing control or suffering a medical emergency. The evidence pointed to intent. She was charged and ultimately convicted on 7 counts, 1 for each life that was lost that afternoon on State Road 67. In June of 2001, Kirby was sentenced to 215 years in prison, a number that reflected both the severity of what the court found her responsible for and the sheer number of families whose lives were permanently altered in a matter of seconds. For the Martinsville community and for Morgan County as a whole, this case became a lasting symbol of how quickly an ordinary afternoon on a familiar road can turn into unimaginable loss. It also became a case study for investigators and prosecutors handling vehicular cases where intent, rather than negligence, is at the center of the evidence. The families who lost loved ones that day carried a grief that extended far beyond the courtroom. 3 generations of one family were affected in a single incident, and the ripple effects moved through their community for years afterward. Their strength in the aftermath and their commitment to honoring the memory of those they lost remains part of how this case is remembered today. If you or someone you know has been affected by grief, trauma, or the sudden loss of a loved one, support is available through the National Alliance for Grieving Children and other local community resources. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 3. Offender, Kelly Cochran. Date, February the 20th, 2016. County, Lake County, Indiana. Some cases in this state don't begin with a single act of violence. They begin years earlier, buried under layers of coercion, fear, and secrets that take investigators far longer to uncover than the crime itself ever did. This is one of those cases, one that started in Northwest Indiana but stretched across state lines before the full picture ever came into focus. Kelly Cochran lived in Hobart, Indiana, a quiet community in Lake County known for its small-town feel just outside the reach of Chicago's skyline. To the people who knew her casually, she may have seemed like an ordinary wife. But investigators would eventually learn that her marriage to Jason Cochran carried a history far more disturbing than anyone around them could have guessed. On February the 20th, 2016, Jason Cochran did not survive the day. Investigators determined that Kelly had administered a lethal dose of heroin to her husband, and in the hours that followed, she took further action that ensured he would not survive. When the details of the case reached court, they revealed something rarely seen in Indiana cases of this nature, a motive rooted not in sudden anger, but in years of buried trauma. According to what Cochran herself admitted, the events of that February day were not isolated. She told investigators that her husband had, in October of 2014, forced her to take part in the killing of her boyfriend at the time, a man named Christopher Reagan, whose remains were discovered dismembered in Iron River, Michigan. Cochran claimed that Jason had orchestrated that earlier act, using coercion and control to force her participation, and that what happened to him in February of 2016 was, in her own words, a form of revenge for what she says he had put her through. This admission complicated the case in ways that captivated investigators and legal analysts across 2 states. Was Kelly Cochran a victim of prolonged psychological control, who eventually turned against her abuser? Or was she a calculated participant in violence who used her own victimization as a narrative to soften how the public and the courts would perceive her? The truth, as is so often the case in situations involving long-term coercive relationships, sat somewhere in a gray area that the justice system had to work to untangle. Investigators from both Indiana and Michigan worked to build a timeline that connected the two cases, more than a year apart, geographically separated but tied together by the same two people. Forensic evidence, digital communications, and Cochran's own statements to law enforcement eventually formed the backbone of the prosecution's case against her. In the end, Kelly Cochran was found responsible for the death of her husband and is currently serving a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. Her case remains one of the more psychologically complex cases to come out of Lake County in recent memory, not because of the violence alone, but because of what it revealed about how control, fear, and retaliation can become intertwined inside a relationship until it becomes almost impossible to say where victimhood ends and culpability begins. For the communities in Hobart and across Northwest Indiana, the case served as a sobering reminder that the most dangerous situations don't always look dangerous from the outside. Co-workers, neighbors, and even close friends of the Cochrans described being stunned when the details came out, insisting that nothing about the couple's public life had hinted at what investigators would eventually uncover. If you or someone you know is in a relationship that involves control, coercion, or fear, please know that confidential help is available 24 hours a day through the National Domestic Violence Hotline. No one should feel they have no way out. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 4. Offender, Amber Pasztor. Date, September the 26th, 2016. County, Elkhart County, Indiana. There are cases that shake a community slowly, over weeks or months, as new information trickles out. And then there are cases that shatter a community in the span of a single afternoon. What happened in Elkhart, Indiana on September the 26th, 2016 falls firmly into the second category. A case that began as a desperate search and ended as one of the most heartbreaking chapters in the county's history. Amber Pasztor was 29 years old, a mother of 2 young children, 7-year-old Liliana Hernandez and 6-year-old Renee Pasztor. On that September afternoon, she took both children from their routine, sparking an immediate and urgent response from local authorities. Within a short time, a statewide Amber Alert had been issued, activating a wide-reaching network of law enforcement, media outlets, and concerned citizens who dropped what they were doing to help search for the 2 missing children. For families across Elkhart County and really across the state, those hours felt agonizingly long. Parents refreshed news updates on their phones. Local radio stations interrupted programming to share alert details. Law enforcement fanned out across the region, chasing every lead, hoping for the outcome every Amber Alert is designed to produce: children found safe. That outcome never came. Hours after the alert went out, Amber Pasztor drove directly to the Elkhart Police Department. When officers approached the vehicle, they discovered that both children were no longer alive. Pasztor told investigators she had used her own hands to end their lives, an admission so difficult to process that even seasoned investigators described the scene as one of the hardest of their careers. As devastating as that revelation was, what came next added an entirely new dimension of shock to an already unbearable case. While in custody, Pasztor also confessed to an earlier, seemingly unrelated case: the shooting death of her 65-year-old neighbor, Frank McClure. That case had gone unsolved for a period of time before her confession connected her directly to it, revealing that this was not the first time law enforcement in the area had unknowingly been searching for answers tied to Amber Pasztor. For investigators, the confession to the McClure case reframed the entire picture of who they were dealing with. It transformed what had initially appeared to be a single, isolated tragedy involving a mother in crisis into a broader pattern that stretched back further than anyone had initially realized, touching multiple families and multiple losses within the same small community. The Elkhart community was left reeling in the aftermath. Vigils were held for Liliana and Renee, with neighbors, classmates, and teachers gathering to grieve two children whose lives had been cut tragically short. Frank McComer's family, too, was left to process the news that the person responsible for his death had been living among them, unconnected in the public eye until Pasztor's own words tied everything together. In court, Amber Pasztor was ultimately sentenced to 130 years in prison, a sentence that reflected the totality of the harm the court found she had caused across all three lives lost. Mental health professionals who later spoke about the broader patterns in cases like this one emphasized how critical it is for communities to recognize warning signs in caregivers who may be experiencing an undiagnosed mental health crisis, and to make sure pathways to help exist before tragedy occurs. This case remains a difficult but important part of the conversation around maternal mental health, isolation, and the importance of accessible intervention resources for parents in crisis. If you are a parent struggling with overwhelming thoughts, or if you know a parent who may need support, please reach out to the National Maternal Mental Health Hotline, available free and confidentially any time of day or night. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed, so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 5. Offender Brandi Worley. Date, November the 17th, 2016. County, Montgomery County, Indiana. There are cases that investigators describe as impossible to prepare for, no matter how many years they've spent in law enforcement. What happened in the small town of Darlington, Indiana, on the night of November the 17th, 2016, is one of those cases. A night that began with a piece of paperwork and ended with a tragedy that would leave an entire county searching for answers that may never fully come. Brandi Worley was 30 years old, a mother of 2 children, 7-year-old Tyler and 3-year-old Charlie. To those who knew the family, the Worley household looked like countless others across rural Montgomery County, a family working through a difficult marriage, the kind of strain many households experience during a divorce. What no one around them could have anticipated was how quickly that strain would turn into unimaginable loss. Earlier that same day, Brandi's husband had officially filed for divorce. For most families, a filing like that marks the beginning of a long, painful, but survivable process: mediation, custody arrangements, the slow rebuilding of 2 separate lives. But for reasons that investigators and mental health professionals have spent years trying to understand, that filing appears to have triggered something in Brandi Worley that led to devastating consequences that same night. Using a combat knife inside the family home, Worley caused fatal harm to both of her children. When the full scope of what had happened became clear to investigators, the reaction across Montgomery County was one of disbelief bordering on shock. This was not a community accustomed to headlines like this. Darlington is a small, tight-knit town, the kind of place where neighbors know each other by name and children play in shared yards. The idea that something of this magnitude could happen inside one of their own homes was almost impossible for residents to process. What made the case even more difficult for investigators to reconcile was what happened next. Rather than fleeing or attempting to conceal what had occurred, Worley herself made the call to emergency services. On that call, she told dispatchers plainly and without hesitation that she had caused her children's deaths, and she explained why. She has stated she did not want her husband to be able to take them from her as part of the impending divorce. That statement became one of the most chilling and closely examined pieces of evidence in the entire case. It reframed the incident in the eyes of prosecutors not as a sudden break from reality, but as a decision rooted in control, an assertion that if she could not have her children, then her husband would not be allowed to have them either. Legal analysts who followed the case pointed to it as an example of a pattern seen tragically in a small number of custody-related cases across the country, where a parent's fear of losing custody becomes twisted into a devastating and irreversible act. Worley was taken into custody without incident. Given the clarity of her own admission on the emergency call, alongside the physical evidence collected at the scene, The case moved through the legal system without the extended courtroom battle that many cases of this severity typically involve. Worley ultimately pleaded guilty to the charges against her and was sentenced to 120 years in prison. For Montgomery County, the sentencing did not undo the grief that had settled over the community. Tyler and Charlie were remembered at a public memorial that drew mourners from well beyond Darlington's town limits, with teachers, classmates, and extended families sharing memories of two children whose lives had barely begun. Their father, who had filed for divorce that very day, was left to carry a grief that few people could ever imagine having to process. Mourning children while also processing that the timing of his own decision had become part of the public narrative surrounding their loss, something family advocates were quick to point out was in no way his responsibility. In the years since, this case has become part of a broader conversation among family court professionals and child advocacy organizations about recognizing warning signs during high-conflict separations and about ensuring that both parents and family courts have access to intervention resources long before a situation reaches a breaking point. If you are going through a difficult separation or custody situation and are struggling with overwhelming thoughts, please reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline or a local family crisis center. Help exists, and reaching out is never a sign of weakness. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 6. Offender, Toni McClure. Date, discovered April the 9th, 2024. County, Marion County, Indiana. Some of the cases we cover on this channel are closed chapters, cases where the trial has concluded, the sentence has been handed down, and the community has moved into whatever version of closure is possible after a tragedy. This case is different. This is a case still unfolding in real time, one where the legal process remains active, and where a small girl named Kinsley Welty is at the center of a story that all of Indianapolis has been watching unfold. On April the 9th, 2024, first responders were called to a residence in Indianapolis, Marion County. What they found inside would become one of the most difficult cases local investigators say they have ever had to process. A 5-year-old girl, Kinsley Welty, was found unresponsive. When paramedics assessed her, they discovered she weighed just 21 pounds, a number so far below a healthy weight for a child her age that it immediately signaled to first responders that something had gone catastrophically wrong long before that April morning. As investigators began piecing together the timeline, it became clear this was not a sudden or isolated event. According to prosecutors, the evidence pointed toward a prolonged period, stretching across multiple months, during which Kinsley was allegedly denied adequate nourishment and subjected to ongoing neglect inside her own home. Toni McClure, the child's mother, was identified as the central figure in the investigation, with prosecutors alleging that she was primarily responsible for the sustained pattern of harm that authorities say led to her daughter's death. It's important, in a case like this one that remains legally active, to be precise about where things currently stand. Toni McClure has been charged in connection with her daughter's death, but as of this recording, her case has not reached a final resolution. In June of 2026, her trial began, and it did not go the way anyone expected. On just its second day, the trial abruptly ended in a mistrial. According to court reporting, the mistrial resulted from serious juror misconduct, specifically that a juror had improperly engaged with a witness outside of the courtroom setting, a violation serious enough that the presiding judge had no choice but to halt proceedings entirely. For a case already carrying immense emotional weight for the Indianapolis community, the mistrial added an additional layer of frustration and delay. Advocates who had been following the case closely expressed disappointment that a resolution would once again be pushed back, extending the wait for anyone hoping for a sense of closure. A new trial has since been scheduled, officially set to begin on August the 24th, 2026. While McClure's case continues to make its way through the courts, 2 other individuals connected to the household have already reached resolutions of their own. Both her boyfriend and her mother, who prosecutors say were aware of and complicit in the conditions inside the home, accepted plea agreements each receiving 20-year sentences in exchange for their cooperation and acknowledgement of their role in what happened. This case has become part of a larger and painfully necessary conversation happening across Indiana about the systems designed to protect children before tragedy occurs. Child welfare advocates have pointed to cases like this one as examples of why community awareness matters so deeply. Neighbors, extended family members, teachers, and anyone with regular contact with a child are often the first line of recognition when something in a household isn't right. Early signs of neglect are not always obvious from the outside, which is exactly why organizations dedicated to child welfare stress that reporting a concern, even one that feels uncertain, can make the difference in a child's life. As this case continues toward its rescheduled trial date, we will be watching, and if there are significant updates, we may revisit this story to share what the courts ultimately decide. Until a verdict is reached, Toni McClure is entitled to the presumption of innocence, and this case remains an active legal matter. If you suspect a child in your life may be experiencing neglect or abuse, please contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, available 24 hours a day, staffed by professionals trained to help you take the next step. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 7. Offender Ashanti Jackson. Date: August the 22nd, 2023. County: Clark County, Indiana. Some cases take investigators only a matter of hours to unravel, because the story presented to them from the very beginning doesn't hold up under even the most basic scrutiny. This is one of those cases. One that started with a frantic drive across state lines to a hospital in Louisville, Kentucky, and ended with a truth far different from what was first reported. Ashanti Jackson lived in Clarksville, Indiana, a small city that sits just across the Ohio River from Louisville, close enough that many residents of Clark County cross the state line regularly for work, shopping, or in this case, a medical emergency. On August the 22nd, 2023, Jackson was staying with her 3-year-old stepdaughter, Melanie Stewart, at a local motel in the area. What happened inside that motel room that day would take investigators time to fully piece together, but the outcome was immediate and devastating. Melanie suffered severe injuries to her head, injuries so significant that she quickly lost consciousness. Rather than seeking help nearby in Indiana, Jackson made the decision to rush the little girl across the river to a hospital in Louisville, where she told medical staff a story that would soon fall apart under examination. According to what Jackson told hospital personnel, Melanie had suffered a sudden medical seizure and fallen from her bed, and that the fall explained her injuries. It's the kind of explanation medical staff hear fairly often in cases involving young children, and doctors initially began treating Melanie based on that account. But something about the nature and severity of her injuries didn't line up with a simple fall, and hospital staff raised concerns that prompted a closer look from both medical examiners and law enforcement. That closer look changed everything. When the full medical evaluation was complete, doctors determined that Melhanie's injuries were not consistent with a fall from a bed at all. The autopsy that followed her death ruled it a homicide, attributing her injuries to blunt impact trauma that investigators concluded could not have occurred the way Jackson had described. The explanation that had bought some initial time now became the very thing that pointed investigators directly back toward Jackson herself. For Clark County investigators, working in close coordination with authorities across the river in Kentucky, the case became a stark example of how quickly a fabricated explanation can crumble once forensic evidence enters the picture. Medical examiners are trained to recognize patterns of injury that simply don't match the story being told. And in Melhanie's case, those patterns told an entirely different story than the one Jackson had offered in the emergency room. Jackson was charged in connection with Melhanie's death, and in November of 2025, she was sentenced to 40 years in prison for aggravated battery resulting in death. For a 3-year-old girl whose life should have still been ahead of her, that outcome brought a measure of accountability, even as it could never undo the loss her family continues to carry. This case has since been referenced by child welfare advocates and pediatric medical professionals as an example of why thorough medical evaluation matters so deeply in cases involving injured children, and why hospital staff are trained to look past an initial explanation when the physical evidence tells a different story. It is often frontline medical workers trained to notice these inconsistencies who become a child's first and most important advocate. If you are a caregiver struggling to manage stress, anger, or overwhelming emotions around a child in your care, please know that support is available through the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, staffed around the clock by trained counselors ready to help before a situation reaches a crisis point. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 8. Offender Alyssa Shepard. Date: October the 30th, 2018. County: Fulton County, Indiana. Not every case on this channel involves a plan, a motive, or a moment of premeditated intent. Some of the most devastating cases in Indiana's history come from a single, split-second failure to stop. A failure that, on one October morning in rural Fulton County, cost an entire community 3 of its youngest members in a matter of seconds. It was a typical morning in Rochester, Indiana, on October the 30th, 2018. Children across Fulton County were doing what children across the state do every school day, gathering near the road, waiting for the yellow bus that would carry them safely to class. On this particular stretch of 2-lane highway, a school bus had come to a complete stop, its red warning lights flashing and its stop arm fully extended outward into the roadway. A signal drivers in every direction are legally required to obey without exception. 24-year-old Alyssa Shepard was driving her pickup truck along that same stretch of highway that morning. For reasons that would later become the subject of intense scrutiny and community outrage, she did not stop. She drove directly past the stopped bus, past its flashing lights and extended stop arm, at the exact moment 4 young children were crossing the highway to board it. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. 4 children were struck in the roadway that morning. 3 of them did not survive. 6-year-old twin brothers Xavier and Mason Engel, and their 9-year-old sister Olivia Stahl. A 4th child suffered severe injuries, but survived the impact. In an instant, one family lost 3 children on the very road where they had stood every school morning, doing nothing more than what millions of children across the country do every single day. The Rochester community and Fulton County as a whole was devastated in a way few small towns ever fully recover from. The Engel and Stahl families had, in a single moment, lost the majority of their children, a loss so profound that grief counselors were brought in not just for the immediate family, but for classmates, teachers, and bus drivers across the district who were left shaken by how easily this could have happened to any child, any morning, on any road in the state. In the aftermath, investigators determined that Shepard's failure to stop for the buses clearly displayed warning signals was the direct cause of the collision. She was charged in connection with the deaths of the 3 children, and the case drew significant attention not only locally, but across Indiana as a whole, becoming a rallying point for renewed conversations about school bus safety statewide. That attention translated into real, lasting change. In direct response to this tragedy, Indiana lawmakers moved to strengthen school bus safety laws, passing stricter mandates designed to increase penalties for drivers who fail to stop for school buses and to expand safety technology, including additional external cameras and warning systems aimed at preventing another tragedy like the one that unfolded in Rochester that October morning. Shepard was ultimately sentenced to a 4-year prison term, of which she served 3 years before being released to a period of home detention and probation. The sentence and the relatively short time served became a point of ongoing public debate, with some feeling the consequences did not fully reflect the scale of the loss suffered by 2 families, while others pointed to the case as a tragic accident born of a split-second failure rather than intentional harm, distinguishing it from the deliberate acts featured elsewhere on this list. What has never been up for debate is the legacy those 3 children left behind. Their names are now permanently tied to Indiana's school bus safety laws, a small but meaningful way their community has ensured that Xavier, Mason, and Olivia's loss continues to protect other children on Indiana roads for years to come. If your family has been affected by the loss of a child in a traffic-related tragedy, support and community resources are available through organizations such as the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's Family Support Networks and local grief counseling centers across Indiana. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 9. Offender, Heidi Marie Littlefield. Date, January 2021. Body discovered March the 4th, 2021. County, Hamilton County, Indiana. Some cases unfold in an instant. Others are built slowly, methodically, over weeks of failed attempts before the final outcome is reached. This is one of the latter, a case that investigators in Carmel, Indiana, would come to describe as one of the most calculated they had encountered, involving not just one attempt to end a man's life, but several before it was finally carried out. Heidi Littlefield was 42 years old, living in Carmel, an affluent suburb north of Indianapolis in Hamilton County known for its manicured neighborhoods and quiet, tree-lined streets. Hardly the backdrop most people would associate with a plotted killing. But behind that quiet suburban setting, Littlefield was locked in a bitter and prolonged custody dispute with her ex-boyfriend, Francis Kelly, over their 2-year-old child, a battle that court records show had grown increasingly hostile in the months leading up to January of 2021. According to investigators, Littlefield did not act on impulse. Instead, prosecutors say she engaged in a calculated, multi-step effort to end Kelly's life, one that involved breaking into his home on more than one occasion. During those break-ins, investigators allege she introduced lethal doses of fentanyl into his food, lacing his miso soup and his oatmeal in an attempt that, remarkably, failed to achieve its intended result the first time, and then the second. For investigators piecing together the case after the fact, the repeated nature of these attempts became one of the most disturbing elements of the entire investigation. This was not a single moment of desperation. It was, according to the evidence prosecutors presented, a sustained campaign, adjusted and repeated across multiple visits to Kelly's home, each time with the same lethal intention behind it. When the poisoning attempts finally left Kelly incapacitated, prosecutors say Littlefield and her adult daughter found him in that state inside his own home. Rather than seeking emergency help, prosecutors allege that Littlefield used that moment to finish what the poisoning had started, using physical force before using his own necktie. One investigators say held a favored, personal significance to Kelly to strangle him. Kelly's remains were not discovered until March the 4th, 2021, when concerned parties, having not heard from him, alerted authorities. What investigators found inside his Carmel home set off a months-long forensic investigation that would eventually connect every piece of the timeline together, from the break-ins to the poisoning attempts to the final, fatal encounter. Central to building that timeline was digital forensic evidence. Investigators reviewing Littlefield's devices uncovered a trail of searches and communications that painted a damning picture of premeditation, reportedly including inquiries into lethal medication dosages in the weeks leading up to Kelly's death. That digital evidence, paired with forensic toxicology findings from the autopsy, allowed prosecutors to construct a case built on a clear and sustained pattern of intent, rather than a single reactive moment. In October of 2022, Heidi Littlefield was sentenced to 115 years in prison, a sentence that reflected both the calculated nature of the crime and the extended period over which prosecutors say it was carried out. For Hamilton County and for the family and friends of Francis Kelly, the case became a sobering example of how custody disputes, when left to escalate without intervention, can spiral into consequences no family court proceeding could have predicted. Kelly's family has since spoken publicly about the importance of taking early warning signs in high-conflict custody situations seriously, urging courts and mediators to recognize when a dispute has moved beyond ordinary contentiousness into something that warrants closer attention. The 2-year-old child at the center of the custody battle that preceded this tragedy is now being raised by extended family. A quiet reminder that in cases like this one, it is often the youngest and most innocent parties who are left to carry the weight of decisions made by the adults responsible for their care. If you are navigating a high-conflict custody situation and feel that tensions are escalating beyond what feels safe, please reach out to your local family court services or the National Domestic Violence Hotline for guidance on safely navigating these circumstances. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 10. Offender, Katrina Fouts. Date, April 2020. Body discovered April the 24th, 2020. County, Hamilton County, Indiana. Our final case takes us back to Hamilton County, Indiana, to a rural stretch outside Noblesville, where a marriage, a friendship, and a carefully researched plan came together in a way that would shock investigators with just how deliberate the entire scheme truly was. Katrina Fouts was 54 years old, married to a man named David Fouts. On the surface, there's appeared to be an ordinary marriage in an ordinary Hamilton County household. But according to prosecutors, Katrina had been planning her husband's death for some time, and she did not intend to act alone. Investigators determined that Katrina had enlisted the help of a family friend, a retired police officer, to assist in carrying out her plan. That detail alone gave the case an unusual and troubling dimension. Someone with law enforcement training and background, someone who understood investigative processes better than the average person, allegedly agreed to participate in the plot rather than report it. According to prosecutors, Katrina's chosen method involved introducing her husband to a toxic substance disguised within his food. She is alleged to have fed him pieces of Littlefield canatum, more commonly known as white dome-cap mushrooms, a species that, while sometimes confused for edible varieties, carries serious toxicity when consumed. Prosecutors say David unknowingly ingested the toxic fungi, and it began to take a severe physical toll on his body, leaving him incapacitated and struggling to breathe. It was at that moment, prosecutors allege, that Katrina's accomplice stepped in to ensure David would not recover, using physical force against him until he stopped moving entirely. The two then transported his body to a remote, rural roadside ditch outside Noblesville, leaving him there without his shoes in a location prosecutors say was chosen specifically for its isolation. David's remains were discovered on April the 24th, 2020, setting off an investigation that would ultimately expose the full scope of what had been planned in the weeks prior. As investigators began examining digital evidence recovered from devices connected to the case, they uncovered a trail that prosecutors described as deeply incriminating. Internet search histories containing queries about lethal medication doses, alongside saved images and screenshots related to toxic mushroom varieties. Evidence that painted a clear picture of premeditation stretching back, well, before the day David lost his life. The involvement of a retired police officer as an alleged accomplice added an unusual layer of complexity to the prosecution's case, raising difficult questions for the Hamilton County community about trust, complicity, and how someone with a background in law enforcement could allegedly become entangled in a plot of this nature rather than intervening to stop it. In April of 2022, Katrina Fouts was sentenced to 34 years in prison for her role in the conspiracy to commit her husband's death, along with an additional charge for failing to report the location of his remains once he was gone. For David Fouts' family, the sentence closed one chapter of a case that had taken 2 years to fully investigate and prosecute, even as the loss of David himself remained something no length of sentence could ever fully address. This case has since been referenced in discussions among forensic toxicologists and investigators as an example of how digital evidence, search histories, saved images, and online activity has become an increasingly critical tool in modern homicide investigations, often providing the clearest window into premeditation that physical evidence alone cannot offer. If you or someone you know is in a relationship where you fear for your safety, please reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, available confidentially, 24 hours a day, every day of the year. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Take just 2 seconds right now to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary from Cold Case Hour. If these stories moved you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment below telling us which case affected you the most. We read every single one, and we'll see you in the next episode. 10 cases, 10 different corners of Indiana, 10 stories that on paper have almost nothing in common, different counties, different decades, different circumstances that led to different courtrooms and different sentences. And yet, taken together, they tell us something about this state that no single case could ever fully capture on its own. From a rental home in Indianapolis to a rural highway in Morgan County, from a quiet Carmel suburb to a roadside ditch outside Noblesville, these cases remind us that tragedy doesn't follow a pattern, and it doesn't respect the boundaries of what a community expects from the people living inside it. Some of these cases involved years of planning. Others unfolded in a single, irreversible moment. Some of the women at the center of these stories were driven by revenge, others by fear, others by a desperate attempt to hold onto control in circumstances that had already spiraled beyond anyone's ability to contain them. What stays with us after looking closely at all 10 of these cases isn't just the loss. Though the loss is immeasurable, it's the names left behind. Andrew Cataldi and Tricia Nordman, Judy Kirby's own children and her nephew, and a family in an oncoming minivan who never saw it coming. Jason Cochran, Liliana and Renee, Tyler and Charlie, Kinsley Welty, whose case is still making its way through the courts even now. Melanie Stewart, Xavier, Mason and Olivia, Francis Kelly, David Fouts. Real people, real families, real communities across this state who are still living with what happened long after the headlines faded. If this episode has done anything, we hope it's reminded you that the system standing between everyday life and tragedy, child welfare check-ins, family court safeguards, school bus safety laws, a neighbor willing to make a call when something doesn't feel right, matter more than we often give them credit for. Several of these cases directly led to real change here in Indiana, from stronger school bus safety mandates to renewed conversations about protecting children in vulnerable households. That's not nothing. That's how accountability turns into prevention. If any part of this episode affected you personally, please don't carry it alone. The National Domestic Violence Hotline and the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline are both available confidentially, 24 hours a day, every day of the year, for anyone who needs to talk to someone. Thank you for spending this time with us here at Cold Case Hour. If you haven't already, take a moment right now to hit that subscribe button so you never miss one of our deep dives into the cases that shaped this state. Drop a comment and let us know which of these 10 cases stayed with you the most. We read every single one. And if you found value in this episode, give it a like before you go. It helps this channel keep bringing these stories and the people behind them the attention they deserve. We'll see you in the next episode.